Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace. My name is Tabassum Halim, and I'm the CEO of Islamic Networks Group, commonly known as ING. For those of you not familiar with us, we are a 28-year-old peace-building organization that provides face-to-face education and engagement opportunities to foster understanding of Muslims and other misunderstood groups, as well as promote harmony among all people. I want to welcome all of you today to this webinar, which focuses on how educators can best accommodate their Muslim students during the spiritual season of Ramadan. I do want to begin with a big shout out to educators who have been nothing less than heroic during this COVID-19 pandemic, dealing with challenges such as moving to online learning, and more importantly, working to keep their students and themselves safe. As we approach the second year of observing Ramadan during the pandemic, with all the changes that it has brought in our daily lives, we'll be looking at how to best accommodate Muslim students in schools, bearing in mind that many of them are in a state of flux, with some going back to in-person learning, while other students or entire schools are still in a virtual learning environment. For our audience information, after this panel discussion, we will share two handouts, one for Muslim parents and one for educators, that will be linked in the comments section of the Facebook page of this webinar. We encourage you to look for them. Now, joining us are three extremely qualified speakers who will provide us with insight and guidelines for how to best support our Muslim students during this special time. I will introduce each panel before they speak. The first speaker, whom we are excited to host, is the California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. Superintendent Thurmond is an educator, social worker, and public school parent who has served the people of California for a decade in elected office. Previously, Superintendent Thurmond served on the Richmond City Council, West Contra Costa Unified School Board, and in the California State Assembly. Since he has an extremely busy schedule, Superintendent Thurmond will be speaking first for a few minutes to set the tone of our conversation before we move to specific best practices on accommodations. Tony, we're very honored to have you join us today. We were very grateful for your recent work on the series we did with you on the education to end hate in our California schools. Please share with us your views on the topic of diversity and inclusion in public education.
Awesome, thank you. It's an honor just to bring greetings on behalf of the California Department of Education and our 6 million students and hundreds of thousands of educators in our state. I wanted to start by saying that I'm grateful to be here and that I want to wish everyone a happy, peaceful, and blessed Ramadan. I hope that it proves to be a time for introspection and prayer and the opportunity to read the Quran, and for all of us to learn and grow. And during that time, I want to encourage our educators to do all that can be done to support our students as they practice their Muslim faith. And so it is how we came to know ING as a partner to Bassem, was to really talk about how do we change perceptions about Islam, about false perceptions, I should say, that many have, that many of our students who practice Islam, who have experienced mistreatment and stereotypes in the classroom. And we're grateful that ING would work with us to put on a wonderful webinar as part of our series on using education to counter hate. And as we continue to see acts of hate impact so many communities, we know that now is a time for us to come together. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity. I want to thank you. I want to thank the entire team at the Islamic Networks Group, including Maha El Ganaidi for her work with us in the webinar, for your team's entire work on our work on ethnic studies. We want our students to see and learn about history that reflects them and the contributions of their ancestors. And it is so important to us that we have a great partnership. So thank you. Looking forward to more conversations. And again, as we prepare to enter Ramadan, again, I want to wish everyone a happy, peaceful, and blessed Ramadan. Thank you, and have a wonderful program.
Thank you so much, Tony, for your remarks and for the important work that you're doing. We look forward to continuing to work with you for the benefit of all our school children. We will now turn our attention to the specifics of best practices in accommodation for diversity. Our first speaker will be ING's Bay Area Director, Isaac Patan, who will be presenting an overview of Ramadan, as well as discussing some of the associated challenges for Muslim students and how best to accommodate and respond to these challenges. Following him will be Brisa Camacho Loval, who is an ING Bay Area board member, as well as an educator at Redwood Day School in Oakland, where ING has presented for many years. Welcome to both of you. Isa, let's start with you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to Tabassum for the introduction, and thank you to Superintendent Thurman for your remarks that you just made. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We have a presentation that I'll be presenting from to talk a little bit about Ramadan, as well as Ramadan fasting and how that might affect Muslim students and what educators can keep in mind as we move through the season. So Ramadan is the name of the 9th month in the Islamic calendar, and it's considered a holy month for Muslims. It is the month in which Muslims believe that the Quran was first revealed, and the Quran is a holy book for Muslims. And for that reason, Muslims really try to reconnect with the Quran during the month and attempt to read it in its entirety over the course of the month. Ramadan is also a time of fasting and extra worship, at which point Muslims will pay special attention to their prayers, perform extra prayers, extra worship, and things like that. Ramadan's a highly communal time, which means that people are constantly inviting one another to their houses for the breaking of the fast and for dinner and things like that. That obviously has been quite affected during the COVID era where we are experiencing social distancing. The way to wish Ramadan and blessed Ramadan to one another is by saying Ramadan Mubarak, which basically, loosely translates to blessed Ramadan. Ramadan the time for Ramadan varies every year slightly, and that's because Muslims, when it comes to their Islamic holidays, follow an Islamic calendar, which dates back to what we may call the Hijra, which is the migration of Muslims from Mecca to Medina in 622. So 622 in the Gregorian calendar would be year 0 in the lunar. And the calendar is lunar, meaning that it begins and ends with the new moon. And so every year, Ramadan moves 11 days earlier in the year when we're using the Gregorian calendar as stationary. And so that means that Ramadan this year is going to begin in less than 2 weeks on April 13th and end around May 12th. Last year, Ramadan was later in April and ended later in May. One of the major practices in Ramadan is fasting, and fasting is the 4th pillar of Islam. And the goals of fasting are many. One, it primarily helps Muslims draw closer to God through these extra activities, including prayer and relying on oneself. Fasting helps Muslims to build on their own willpower and learn a sense of self-control. It provides Muslims with a sense of gratitude for what they do have, as well as compassion for those who are less fortunate, who may not be able to be eating and afford food throughout the day. Ramadan is really a time for heightened self-awareness and introspection, where cultivating good character is the major goal, and that is done by being more conscious of oneself and how they're coming across, and avoiding prescribed thoughts or actions. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, that Ramadan is incredibly communal. And so it's really a time where Muslims can strengthen and rebuild some important community relations, whether by going to the mosque or Muslim house of worship, or seeing those people you may only see once a year. Overall, Ramadan is really a time of intense spiritual rejuvenation and what we call self-reflection. Now, the fast for Ramadan will vary. As I mentioned, the calendar of Ramadan, changes every year. This year, it's in the spring. In about 15 years, it's going to be in the fall, and so on. And so based on that, adults who are physically able to will refrain from food, drink, and intimacy during the daylight hours. And the daylight hours are going to vary. In the summer, that's going to be quite long. And in the winter, that will be quite short. So it can last anywhere between 12 to 16, 20 hours a day. Now, when it comes to a typical day, observant Muslims typically like to wake up before dawn and eat a small meal. And that meal can be something like breakfast, whether it's, for students, oatmeal or cereal or things like that, or it can be something more heavy, like perhaps the dinner from the night before. And after that, they'll follow up by performing the morning prayer. And students may either go back to sleep or they may go to work or school, depending on what their schedule is like. If they're able to make adjustments into their schedule, they will, but that may not be the case in a lot of situations. And they'll continue on through the day until they break the fast at sunset. And they'll do that either at home or perhaps at a friend's house or at the mosque, if the mosque is somewhere that's open for dinner. And during Ramadan, as I mentioned, Muslims are constantly thinking about their fast and more in tune with their worship. And part of that involves, making sure to perform their 5 daily prayers if they're not doing that throughout the year. And if they are, they might actually do some extra prayers. One of them, which is the Taraweeh, which is at night. And it's, it's just another opportune time to engage in worship. When it comes to special foods, I think a lot of people like to ask us, Muslims come from all over the world, and there are 1.8 billion of them around, and they come from different cultures and nations and so on. So there's no one food for Ramadan. However, it is prophetic tradition, meaning tradition that follows the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to break the fast with dates and water or some sort of milk. And then everything after that is really based on the culture of the people. That could include soup or appetizers. Some cultures really have a lot of fried food in the morning, or not in the morning, but to break fast and things like that. And then it's a really great time to experience new foods and encourage one another to share in the food that others are eating. Another major important thing is that there are quite a few groups of people that are exempt from fasting, and that includes elderly, sick, travelers, pregnant and breastfeeding women, as well as children. And in some situations, people may be able to make up their fast by fasting the days that they missed at a later time, or by feeding the poor if they can't do that. Now, when it comes to Muslim students, there are a few things to keep in mind. And the first is that, this will vary based on who your students are. So younger children are not necessarily required to fast up until, those who are prepubescent. However, they may still choose to, especially if they see that their parents or their siblings are. And by middle school, most observant Muslim teenagers will begin fasting. I believe I started fasting regularly at the age 11, and that was when I was in 7th grade. And then fasting students may then attend night prayers with their families. And so that combination really includes a pretty busy day where they're not eating a whole lot during the day, and at night they're occupied with extra acts of worship, which means that they may be extra tired. And this is, I think, really important to note. A few things here are important to note. Number one is that, ultimately Muslims are very diverse, and there's going to be some students that are fasting and some that are not. And so it's, it's best to not assume. And there may be some students in elementary school that choose to fast. And then furthermore, in an age where, most students are online, where there is Zoom exhaustion and already heightened sense of anxiety brought upon Muslims by the pandemic, we can see that Ramadan may be a time where they may be extra, their energy levels may be lower than even normal. And then when it comes to accommodating students, there are a few things that are, good to keep in mind. Number one is to, actually announce the start of Ramadan in the school newsletter or just keep it on the calendar. Unfortunately, Muslim students, especially at the time of April, go through their year where they see kind of a lot being done in a school for Christmas or even Hanukkah, but don't see that same energy and effort put into Ramadan. And so that sort of thing is really important to them. Greeting Muslim students with a Ramadan greeting, which is Ramadan Mubarak. I mentioned Blessed Ramadan. And then allowing fasting students to kind of have a few accommodations. And that might include spending lunchtime in the library or the computer lab so they're not kind of around a bunch of other students that are eating, being excused from strenuous activities in gym. They may want to save their treats from like class parties that they can eat later when they're able to. Some students may choose and may be interested in actually talking a little about Ramadan to the class. And that's a great way for them. And we have some resources, which we'll show in the handout, that would enable students to do so. Other things that are important, especially during COVID with distanced learning, is just more flexibility in the schedule to support fasting students. And that relates a lot to like time-bound activities. And so if activities are due, just being conscious of when activities are due, and if they could be due later in the night, that might give students an opportunity to work on them after they've eaten a full meal. Or if they're due like early in the morning, then perhaps they could, start to do some of those assignments after they've eaten the morning meal. And so extensions, just being, kind of aware of the students and their limitations, I think go a long way when it comes to the month. And when it comes to Ramadan around the world, in many Muslim majority countries, Ramadan is really associated with, lights and lanterns and just busyness, where like at night, the entire street kind of lights up and everyone's out and about. When it comes to places like Turkey or Kenya, they may beat drums to wake people up for the pre-fast meal in the morning. Some way we actually beat a drum at night to break the fast. And it's often common for mosques to just serve dates, appetizers, and fruits for iftar or the breaking of the fast in the mosque. And then the end of Ramadan is called Eid al-Fitr. It is one of the major holidays for Muslims, and it literally translates to festival of breaking the fast. It comes right after Ramadan, and it follows the lunar calendar. So every year it's going to be 11 days earlier. This year I mentioned Ramadan's Eid is set to be around May 12th. And that's another opportunity for Muslim students to come and share a little bit about what their traditions are like for that. They may not actually be in school on Eid, and so kind of making sure not to assign major projects or tests on that day really go a long way. And it's for younger students, especially in elementary school, it's an opportunity to invite the parents of those students to come into the classroom and kind of make dessert and explain a little bit more about the holiday. The greeting for Eid is Eid Mubarak, which translates to blessed holiday. And so that is all for my section now. I'm happy to take more questions as there we go. I'm happy to take more questions during the Q&A section.
Thank you, Isa, for that wonderful overview and a lot of helpful hints. Now, we'd love to hear from Brisa.
Thank you, Tabassum. Thank you, Ishaq, and thank you, Superintendent Thurman, for your remarks. So as mentioned, I will be speaking from the classroom lens in consideration of what we as educators can do to best support our Muslim students who are fasting during the month of Ramadan. And first and foremost, teachers should plan to check in with their Muslim students to hear from students what might come up, what accommodations might be helpful, and to really center what these students ask for during the month of Ramadan at school. In my experience teaching middle school, I can recall a year where I had only one student observing Ramadan in their class. And this student that I'm thinking of was a student who didn't like to draw a lot of attention to themselves. And there was not much discussion about Ramadan or their fasting before, during, or after their fasting at school. At the time, it seemed that few of their peers were even aware that the student was fasting, and the student didn't feel the need to share with their peers. So this is of note to me because each situation and the needs of your Muslim population in schools will be as diverse as the experiences of your kids. You may have one student in a class and you may have cohorts of students fasting, but ultimately it is dependent on what those students need, and that is our role as educators, is to check in and center their needs. So another important element of checking in, again, really giving agency to your students and following their lead, is to determine whether your students would like to have a class conversation to educate or answer questions of peers, whether this is a conversation they would like you to lead or they would like to initiate, or whether they feel it is necessary. Having a teacher ally who can take on the role of relaying helpful information to other teachers, faculty and staff, or students, so that the onus does not fall entirely on your Muslim students to explain and advocate for themselves, is the goal. And it's important to take into account the toll of this pandemic year, as Ishaq mentioned. In addition to the fatigue that students fasting will feel during school, the pandemic has taken a toll on all students. And with this past year of distance learning, spending an entire school day on Zoom is tiring. So students that are fasting will be experiencing another layer of fatigue. But there may be specific accommodations that your fasting students may need, like taking walking breaks during class if they're in person, potentially turning off the Zoom camera if they're remote. And this would be something discussed between the educators and the students. So after checking in with your students, there are ways we as educators can structure classes using a universal design approach that will be beneficial to all students in the classroom and not single out your fasting students. Again, in consideration of the toll of the pandemic, and specifically for students who are doing remote school, who are exhausted in the school day, and then students fasting who will be even more exhausted, educators can consider breaking lessons into chunks with built-in breaks between class activities. So for students in the classroom, that means a natural break where they can move, get up. And for students on Zoom, it means a moment between lessons where they can take a break, breathe, and rest. Additionally, teachers may consider offering more small group activities during this time, as it can be easier for students to remain engaged one-on-one. For students experiencing fatigue, working in small groups or with another peer may allow them to engage in the lesson more intimately, as opposed to in a whole class discussion where it can be easy to succumb to fatigue. Other considerations or approaches that we as educators may plan for are assigning longer term projects that allow students to work on a more independent pace and over time. If students have more flexibility with their work schedule, this can support students that are fasting in that they'll be able to complete work during times when they're less fatigued, whether this be at night or over the weekend. Educators may also consider allowing assignments to be due at the end of the night rather than after class. And we've seen that during the pandemic, especially for students at home doing remote learning, essentially all classwork has become homework. There isn't much of a distinction as it's all being done at home. But if we design the class so that all students turn in work in the evening rather than during class, this is a support to all students and will allow your fasting students to work on school after breaking their fast at night. And it will also not single out your Muslim students in the classroom. So these are some specific ideas for structuring the class in support of students fasting for Ramadan. But it is key to remember that all of this planning begins by checking in with your students, constantly being flexible to their needs and whatever supports your students may discover they need throughout the month of Ramadan. Because again, this may change and they may realize that something is working, something is not, or they are needing some alternative accommodations. So that's the end of my segment. But again, I'm open for more questions later on.
Thank you, Brisa, and to all of our panelists. All of you have offered some excellent insights and recommendations. You have provided us with a lot to think about, but I am sure there are still issues that can be expanded upon. At this time, we will start taking questions from the audience. And so we have one for a teacher saying, I want to ensure my students have an opportunity to discuss Ramadan, but I also don't want to put them on the spot. How do I manage this?
So I guess my first question, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Is there room within the curriculum for your students to be learning about Islam anyway?
It could be, I would, if you could answer both ways.
Okay. So again, I think it comes back to checking in with the students because you don't want to put the onus entirely on the student, and you may have a student who doesn't want an additional spotlight. So it really comes down to checking in with the students, but also checking in with other teachers and figuring out as a school where there is room to fit this conversation into the curriculum. Because it's important to be having conversations of different cultures, different religions, different practices, and in that way incorporating it into the school curriculum rather than just as a one-off for your student who is fasting. And again, as mentioned before, there are resources that will be shared at the end of this presentation, but it could be a good opportunity to bring in outside speakers if the school is not prepared to or ready to incorporate this into their curriculum on their own. But again, checking in with students and figuring out, following their lead.
Okay. And this is...
Can I actually add something in there? I did just want to mention, thank you. And Brisa, I think that's so important, is to check in. I did want to mention that for those students who are actually interested in, providing presentations or things like that, we do have a whole program at ING, which basically works with Muslim teenagers to enable them, builds up their confidence and enable them with the resources and presentations and tools so that they could kind of deliver deliver the presentations in the classroom. So I would recommend teachers that if you do have students in there, then in the handout that Brisa mentioned, there's going to be tons of resources for students themselves to actually take it and be able to answer questions for their peers.
Okay, wonderful. Isaac, actually, let me ask you this question, direct this question to you. Is there anything I need to keep in mind when reaching out to the parents of my Muslim students? Great.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think number one is it's always really great to get parents involved. I think that's just across the board, having a parent invested in their child's education is really key. And it also helps to bridge that gap that exists between home and school when everything is kind of more integrated holistically. And so when it comes to Muslim parents, there are a few things to keep in mind with the students is number one, depending on the background of them, they may be very busy and they may have a lot of work and extra jobs. And if they're new immigrants, they may actually have limited English. And so when approaching parents of different backgrounds, I think bearing in mind the ethnic identity of the student in addition to their Muslim identity is key. And then being able to provide translation services if needed. There's also certain gender dynamics that may exist at home that would just be important to mind in terms of males interacting with males and females interacting with females. And overall, I would say though that another way to get involved, if you have a community, a lot of times, you might have a community where there are actually a good amount of Muslim students in the region coming from a particular background. And so getting involved with one parent who can then be a liaison to the other parents is really key, where, if some parents are a little bit hesitant to approach the school, that one parent can kind of act as that major guide to spearhead the communications. And so those are a few things I would keep in mind when reaching out to Muslim parents, especially those parents that are more new to the country.
Thank you. Those are really very good ideas. And I would think that even throughout the school year, instead of waiting till Ramadan, just trying to kind of build up the relationship with the parents, and so that they don't feel as hesitant. about asking questions, or when the teacher needs them as a resource, maybe would feel more comfortable reaching out to the parents.
Yeah.
So we have another question from a teacher, and she says, in elementary school specifically, how can we support our kids and our colleagues in a genuine and meaningful way? We have standardized testing, and although they may not be fasting, that doesn't mean their typical structure doesn't look differently. So I think this is geared more towards Brisa.
I'm happy to answer. And then Ishaq, speaking from experience, if you want to jump in. Again, I think structuring in breaks for students and hearing from the students. In the case of elementary students, it might be also bringing in parents. So developing that relationship and figuring out what students will need during the day, and just being flexible and open to those conversations. Is there something you would like to add?
Yeah, I think want to emphasize especially at a younger age, really involving the family and the parents. I'm sure there are tons of, especially when it comes to Ramadan, there are tons of excited parents that would be more than happy to come into the school and talk a little about Ramadan and bake all of the students a bunch of treats. I think, parents would really jump on that. So that sort of thing, I think, is really key. I noticed that the question also had information on colleagues, and I'm not sure if in this school there are Muslim teachers and colleagues, but from just an administrator level, I would just say that, bearing in mind that a teacher is also, it's incredibly exhausting to be a teacher, and takes a lot out of you to be available and ready the whole day. So, making sure that that teacher feels supported in whatever their practices are, and offering to watch their students for a few minutes so that they can go pray, or that they can at least have a little bit of a break. I think those are a few things as well.
Wonderful. These were excellent questions and responses, and I wish we had more time, but I want to be mindful of both our panelists and audience members. I would like to conclude today's panel with a number of resources that we provide at ING to teach about Ramadan and related topics. Hopefully, they will be valuable resources for both teachers and parents as we approach the month of Ramadan. Do we have?
I can share my screen, Tabassum, if you'd like, and you can go from there.
Okay.
Are you seeing them?
Yes, yes. So here are the where you would find a handout for educators. And we have the how educators can accommodate their Muslim students during the spiritual season. And ING offers the specific resources, overview about Ramadan and fasting, digital presentation about Ramadan and fasting, calendar of important Islamic dates, and so on and so forth. The answers, specifically answers to frequently asked questions about Muslims and their faith, educator school toolkit, requesting a speaker on Muslims and their faith, request an interfaith panel on religious holidays. And you can view the series and resource handouts at ing.org/Ramadan webinars. And finally, as a reminder, look for our handouts for Muslim students, for parents, for educators, and for administrators that are posted in the comments section of this Facebook Live event. I want to conclude by first thanking all of our panelists for taking the time to share their expertise with us today. I also want to thank all of you who joined us virtually and hope this was a valuable experience. A recording of this panel will be made available shortly. Feel free to share it with friends who might benefit. Isa, would you like to add anything else?
No, I'm all set. Thank you all so much for joining today. And thank you to Bassem as well for moderating the conversation so well.
And thank you to everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon all of you.